In this news roundup of the week for 16th of September 2022. President Putin has a bad week in the war and not a great time with China's Xi Jinping, who has concerns about Ukraine. Sweden sees an election upheaval as concern about gun crime and immigration creates a populist backlash, and the second largest cryptocurrency slashes its massive energy use at a stroke. But will others follow? And in this week's Short Thought, how our values are changing and we didn't notice much. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met for summit talks this week, and it seems that Putin didn't get quite the warm reception that he was hoping for. Not that Xi said anything in public that would be considered critical of his ally. China has been extremely careful not to do so at any point in the Ukraine war. But Putin himself specifically made reference to the conversations that have been happening. He said to the Chinese leader this: "We highly appreciate the balanced position of our Chinese friends in relation to the Ukrainian crisis. We understand your questions and concerns on this matter. During today's meeting, we will of course explain our position." He went out of his way to give explicit support to China over Taiwan. "We adhere to the principle of one China. We condemn the provocation of the US and their satellites in the Taiwan Strait." That last a reference to agreed funding by the US Congress for military support for Taiwan. If he had come hoping for a reciprocal statement, it was not to be. Xi Jinping welcomed Russia's support for its position on Taiwan, but did not mention Ukraine by name at all. And the major Chinese official news outlets didn't mention Putin's reference to those concerns, but they did major on one thing that Xi Jinping said among the various declarations of support. He said, "In the face of changes of the world, of our times and of history, China will work with Russia to fulfill their responsibilities as major countries and play a leading role in injecting stability and positive energy into a world of change and disorder." If you're looking for clues as to China's misgivings, I guess they are contained within those words. China's been playing the long game with regard to its emergence as the next major world power to replace the United States. And although facing certain problems to be overcome, particularly its high debt, ailing property market and flatlining population growth, it nevertheless felt that the status quo was suiting it just fine. China incrementally growing, its internal political stability in stark contrast to the divisions in America, meaning that it fully expected to win this particular struggle for supremacy without necessarily a shot being fired. Its interests have not exactly been served by Russia upending the table and throwing everything into the air. As a result, China has had to walk a fine line between showing support for its ally while avoiding any actions that would invite American sanctions. Having stood firm with Russia before the Ukraine war started, as a united front against the dominance of the West, this was suddenly an incredibly uncomfortable place to be. Chinese values have historically stressed harmony. Chinese military strategy has often focused more on the political manoeuvring that might avoid outright conflict, winning the war without firing a shot, than it does in how to fight the actual battles. So then along comes Russia, invades its neighbour, does so noisily, destructively, and even more problematically badly. Some people thought that Russia's invasion might be the start of a united front against the West, could herald the imminent invasion of Taiwan as an opportunistic strike while attention is directed elsewhere. While you couldn't count that out, doing so in this way certainly wasn't Xi Jinping's plan A. And you can see it in his words now: play a leading role in injecting stability and positive energy into a world of change and disorder. His emphasis was additionally on building the alternative network of allies and supporters who become part of the non-Western aligned geopolitical grouping. He said China and Russia should be focusing on cooperation through frameworks like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the summit they're attending, as well as the BRICS network of emerging nations. At least the two leaders were able to agree on other things more wholeheartedly, namely bashing the unipolar power pretensions of America. Beijing, while it hasn't supported or condemned Russia's invasion, has criticised the West for financial sanctions on Russia, even as a number of Chinese companies have been seen navigating the landscape very carefully, seeking not to attract penalties for breaking sanctions. But what didn't come out of the summit were any new substantive agreements. If that was a blow to Putin, well, it probably hardly registered on the scale of blows that he's had this week, specifically in the gains made by Ukraine in taking back previously Russian-held territory. The Ukrainian success was largely down to the highly effective piece of bluff, where it had publicly announced the long-awaited offensive to liberate parts of the Kherson region in the south. Russia is believed to have moved most of its best units to meet the threat and to push ahead with its own attacks in Donetsk, and this left the northeast weakened. And that's why Ukraine's actual operation in Kharkiv led to a total collapse of the Russian side, with its forces abandoning masses of weaponry and just fleeing for their lives. As a result, Russia's aims to take the entire Donbass region now seem completely out of scope. Ukraine has enhanced international respect for its own forces while making a laughing stock of their enemies. And Russia's planned referendum in Donbass for its residents to declare their desire to join Russia unexpectedly cancelled. Russia claimed that this was all part of a planned, orderly retreat, because that always involves people leaving vast amounts of equipment behind for the enemy to capture. Indeed, so orderly was it that President Putin sacked the commander held to be to blame for the defeat, Lieutenant General Roman Bergnikov, who was only appointed 16 days earlier than the last one was sacked. He's now been replaced by Colonel General Alexander Lapin, according to Ukraine's intelligence forces. If true, you have to be wondering if anyone at all congratulated him on his promotion, or instead simply quietly gave thanks that it hadn't been them instead. The setback for Russia on the battlefield has been celebrated by many Western commentators, of course. Numerous others, though, have been sounding caution. Firstly, because this thing is still far from over, but more specifically, some saying that a weakened Russia, led by a wounded Putin, is the most dangerous state it could be in. Certainly, there are nationalist commentators and war bloggers within Russia demanding that the tide be turned with the use of nuclear weapons as a weapon of first resort. And whether or not that's seriously mainstream sentiment, the internal pressure on Putin is likely to be more serious from those who agree with the war and think that it's just been done incompetently than those who would always have opposed it in principle. But this is where you could see the potential role of Xi Jinping and his interest in getting Russia on side for a more measured building of the alternative world order. Stability and positive energy, remember, not a scenario enhanced by the use of nuclear weapons. Which is all well and good, but Putin can surely not survive as leader if Ukraine simply wins the war and achieves its goal of ejecting all Russian forces from its territory, especially if that additionally includes Crimea. So whether even Xi Jinping can constrain how Putin sees his strategic options is a seriously open question. Elsewhere, meanwhile, people lose their position in a more conventional way, by losing elections. For example, Sweden's centre-left coalition government, which lost the latest election this week by a narrow 176 seats to 173. A four-party bloc from the political right will be aiming to form the next administration. This is notable for two reasons. One, the winning coalition includes the Swedish Democrats, which was for a long time treated as a pariah far-right party, one that nobody would ever think about welcoming into their coalition. And two, the shift largely reflects how Swedish society is pushing back against a growing wave of gang violence that many hold to be the consequence of the country's long policy of liberalism when it comes to immigration. With an irony that comes with coalition politics, the outgoing Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson's Social Democrats Party is still the largest single party in the parliament. It even gained votes this election compared to the last one. But it's the size of the coalition that ultimately counts. The new coalition is made up of the controversial Swedish Democrats, the Moderate Party, Christian Democrats and Liberals. The Swedish Democrats won around 20% of the vote, having campaigned strongly on those issues of gang violence and immigration. That made them the largest single party of a new coalition. However, the party's leader, Jimmy Åkesson, will not become the new Prime Minister. Coalition politics again. The fact is that all the parties to the coalition may have decided to accept the Swedish Democrats into their group, but they would not necessarily agree to do so if Åkesson got the top job. So with 68 seats, nearly but not quite as many as the Swedish Democrats' 73, the role will be taken by the leader of the moderates, Ulf Kristersson, assuming he can carve out a practical agreement with his partners about who's going to do what in the new government, and it could all still fall apart. It may well be that while agreeing to certain policy positions to get their support, the Swedish Democrats will not formally be part of the coalition, since some of the others are reluctant to serve alongside them. In that case, policies would need to be agreed to achieve that support, with certainly a lot of focus on more restrictive policies towards immigration, criminal justice measures towards existing immigrants convicted of gang violence. Sweden is providing an unfortunate case study right now in how not to do immigration. Having a history of being a rather homogenous society, it hasn't by all accounts found it easy to integrate newcomers into its values and traditions. The country saw significant migration from Iran in the late 1980s, the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and when Europe had its peak of large-scale immigration in 2016 with the influx of largely Syrian refugees, it was Sweden alongside Germany that persisted with a more or less open border policy. So what does that mean in practice? Figures collected last year show that it had nearly 200,000 residents who were born in Syria. That's out of a population of around 10 million. And it's not just about the overall numbers. The low level of integration means that many of those immigrants live in specific areas, and those areas have become rife with gang crime. The unemployment rate amongst immigrants is 4 times higher than for native Swedes, which creates a downward spiral of temptation to engage in crime, and also the perception, rightly or wrongly, amongst some Swedes that immigrants are largely being attracted to the country to live off its generous benefit system. So far this year, there have been around 50 fatal shootings, and hence the "Make Sweden Safe Again" messaging of the Swedish Democrats has been finding fertile ground. The party promises to restore what are held to be traditional Swedish values. The situation with Sweden, though, really underlines the fact that populism on the political right is generally on the rise across Europe. Some of that is also fed from the consequences of immigration policies of the past, but of course right now it's getting a strong boost from the extreme consequences of the cost of living crisis. One EU official told Politico website, "In a lot of countries this is about the survival of their governments. The resilience of Europe will be tested in all EU countries." This was echoed by Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the International Monetary Fund, who predicted that a cold winter would plunge Europe into social unrest. If we do see a wave of populism across the continent, it won't be the first in recent history. The financial crisis of 2008, the immigration crisis from 2014 to 2016 saw 2 previous waves. And some hold that this is what Vladimir Putin has been counting on, the idea that political leaders would ultimately cave to Russia's demands rather than lose their own democratic support and be cast from office. Hungary's there as an example to them all, having already signed a new gas deal with Russia's Gazprom. Bulgaria is also considering a return to buying Russian gas. The EU is trying to stave off problems by undertaking a €140 billion windfall tax against energy companies, drawing attention to the record profits that they've been making while everyone else struggles. And several European governments are now taking action to try to shield their consumers from the effects of energy prices. So Germany giving €300 energy allowances to workers, Greece subsidising up to 94% of energy bills, France saying that gas increases will be capped at 15% next year, while the government is putting in €16 billion of support. In the UK, of course, the government is capping home energy bills at £2,500 per year, more than £1,000 less than would otherwise have been the case. Will such measures be enough to stave off social unrest? doubtful, at least if it's a cold winter. If sun could help by using less energy, it would make a start. No problem. How about saving in one fell swoop the electricity consumption of a medium-sized country? The second largest cryptocurrency, Ethereum, has completed a change in how it works that will have the effect of reducing its energy by more than 99%. As you probably know, some of the top cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, have relied on being produced by a process that is incredibly intensive use of computer processing power. And that gets increasingly more so the more gets produced. This has seen huge server farms being set up to mine Bitcoin and Ethereum in various parts of the world where energy was available and, at least at the time, cheap. It was also always controversial because you suddenly had these digital currencies emerging as major world consumers of energy at a time when we want to decarbonise that energy. And perhaps it would be useful if we weren't consuming so much of it for things that might be considered to be unnecessary. So the standard version of crypto mining sees those banks of computers generating huge amounts of data to validate transactions and generate new tokens, a concept known as proof of work. It's designed to be highly secure, which obviously an online currency needs to be. Ethereum has moved from being produced in that way towards what's described instead as a proof of stake, where individuals and companies act as validators, pledging or staking their own existing Ether coins as a form of guarantee to win newly created tokens. I can't say I entirely get my head around how it works, but the point is that before the change, Ethereum mining used up as much electricity as the nation of Austria, 72 terawatt hours per year. The change for this one currency, Ethereum, could represent 0.2% of the electricity consumption of the whole world disappearing overnight. Now, I know 0.2% doesn't sound like a lot, but of the entire world's electricity consumption, it is pretty huge. Now that this change has been demonstrated, it rather shifts the spotlight back to Bitcoin, which is currently responsible for as much electricity consumption as Sweden. The pressure is somewhat increased by the energy crisis, not just because the social value of energy consumption is rather high, meaning we'd like to waste as little of it as possible, but also because the spiralling cost of energy consumption shifts the commercial value of mining cryptocurrency in the first place, since all that energy consumption is now very expensive and eats away the profits. The thing is that Ethereum was controlled by its founder and inventor, Vitalik Buterin. He became personally committed to the transition to a low-energy format and announced the completion of it via Twitter. Bitcoin has no such strong central leadership, and its network of Bitcoin miners will resist change so long as the current model is a reliable generator of income. Profitability for Bitcoin mining has certainly hit new lows thanks to those energy prices. That has seen some of the less efficient operations driven out of production, but that just creates more capacity for the efficient operators who can remain profitable enough, hoping that circumstances will again become more favourable, with them then well placed to profit handsomely. And that's made more complicated, of course, by all of those that were mining Ethereum, around 30% of whom are now piling into other crypto coins. So the obvious alternative for them, a coin named Ethereum Classic, saw such an influx of computing power that the reward for one fell over 24 hours from 70 cents to just 11. In spite of the volatility, the miners will continue to chase their opportunities to burn electricity for money so long as it works. But you could see over time governments becoming more and more likely to ban trade in the energy-heavy crypto as the more eco-friendly versions become seen as stable and viable. So change may well be coming one way or another, thanks to the lead that Ethereum has given. If the column writers of the press are to be believed, the British people are currently wrestling with questions of national identity now that the Queen has gone. Either that, or the mainstream media's traditional inability to maintain any sense of balance when something like this happens is making them question their sanity. But it would be understandable. The values of stoicism and devotion to duty above all else that the Queen typified They're values that the country admires, but people are uneasily only too aware that they're not really representative of who we are as a nation anymore. I mean, the new king lost his temper the other day over a leaking pen. So for all that he might be promising to keep calm and carry on in the Queen's best tradition, yeah, it's not likely. The point is that society is changing, and that change infects institutions however high and mighty they may be. This week we saw several people who protested against the monarchy who were arrested by the police for their trouble, even though all they were doing was holding a sign or, heckling the king. Members of Parliament from the governing party were quick to communicate to the police a reminder that freedom of speech still applies in this country. People should only be arrested if they're actually doing something illegal. So all is not yet lost. But it rather underlines that over the course of a pandemic and with the introduction of non-crime hate incidents and the idea that police should be monitoring what people say on Twitter, we have drifted slightly in the direction of a police state, where the compulsion of government is used to enforce beliefs and opinions to support the orthodoxy. Now, in spite of how much people will amplify those aberrations for clicks and views, I do still think it's relatively early signs, an indicator that humans in a time of change don't always show good judgment. But it would be ironic if, in the process of mourning someone who typified the values we wish we had, we took that as the excuse for giving in to the significantly less noble behaviours we fear are lurking beneath the surface. As for me, I've been ignoring most of the first dozen pages by the press this week. I'm perfectly respectful of the process that's going on. Well, respectful for a Republican, as we've discussed. But I will zone back in on Monday for the funeral itself. Unlike most of the country by then, at least I won't be so jaded by it all, by the obsession that everyone's been exposed to. When your society takes a certain obsession, such that it loses any sense of objectivity or self-awareness, you can always take it as an opportunity to step back, see it from a distance, focus on the cultural phenomenon you're witnessing rather than the object they're obsessing about, as an anthropologist would, curious and fascinated how our group behaviours sometimes work. And not least because that will give you the space to frame what values you choose to take from our changing current situation, rather than necessarily defaulting to that of the popular sentiment. Alright, only one video from me this week, as you might have noticed. I decided to spend a bit more time on the other one I've been working on to get it as good as I can, rather than let the deadline mean that it was pushed out slightly rushed. Also, a values decision. You can let me know later if the extra time was worth it when it comes out. So it just remains for me to thank the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without that support, I couldn't produce what I do for this channel, and certainly not while sitting in this YouTube niche where YouTube doesn't know what to do with me. We attract an important subgroup of people here, of those who don't just want to watch videos that affirm their own preconceptions, which outrage them at the behaviour of those on the opposite side to them, but instead people who want to see where the evidence goes and to hear the balanced arguments, and to sometimes, maybe even quite often, have their own beliefs constructively and usefully challenged, to have thereby their own thought processes stimulated. The YouTube algorithm can't cope with that because most people in the audience don't want it. They just want to be entertained or have their own beliefs affirmed. And so the support of the Patreon community comes into its own. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.